Welcome to the Art of Action Figures. On this episode, we'll be talking about Medicom toy, Mafex, Marvel, Wolverine comic version action figure. This is Mafex figure number 96. Although this figure recently got a reissue, this is not the reissue, this is the original version. I've been wanting to do a retrospective review of some of these Mafex X-Men figures because I think they look really good on camera and I wanted to enjoy that myself. So hopefully there are other people out there who will enjoy it, and I thought with some of these figures getting reissued and the popularity of X-Men 97, now would be as good a time as any. I am not an X-Men comic book expert. Instead, like many people, I'm sure my affinity for these characters and their 90s costumes in particular comes from the X-Men animated series, which I was never able to watch consistently enough to follow any of the big plots throughout the series. Was still enjoyable enough to at least develop an attachment to the characters, their personalities, their costumes, their powers, and led me to somehow acquiring, of all things, a Jim Lee Wolverine bath towel, which was my favorite bath towel for some time. I played a fair bit of Marvel vs. Capcom 2 and would always pick a pretty X-Men heavy team. That's kind of how I approach X-Men. For whatever reason, Mafex, especially their Marvel comic figures, seem to be a pretty contentious subject. And maybe that's just a US-centric perspective where Hasbro has such a grip on the Marvel figure market with their Marvel Legends line. I don't think Mafex is perfect. There are definitely flaws, but there's a lot to like about what they're doing with their figures too, and I think it gets drowned out. I don't know, Mafex seems to be unable to keep these in stock, which just doesn't line up with that. So let's talk about this Mafex Wolverine number 96. On the front of the box, we have all of your logos: Medicom toy, Mafex, Marvel, Wolverine, X-Men, Marvel, comic panel up here, figure photo towards the bottom. It has this blue dot matrix comic pattern, which is pretty cool. Some sort of line art back there. You can see Wolverine's claws. On the right hand side, we have the portrait of Wolverine from the comics. Name of the figure, X-Men logo. Same sort of deal at the top. Similar situation on the left. And on the back, promotional images showing off the different accessories snicked around the bottom. One of the more interesting points about Mafex figures is they're intended for ages 15 plus versus Hasbro's 4 plus, which lets them do things like make the claws out of harder plastic that holds its shape better. They can use smaller parts for more intricate points of articulation throughout the figure, and I think that actually makes a bigger difference than people think about. Choking hazard, small part, not for children under 3 years. Medicom toy official holographic foil sticker, letting you know this is the real deal. A reissue has been updated to include the sprues that Mafex now includes with all their figures' alternate hands, making it easier to safely swap them out on the wrist pegs, which are often a point of failure for import, especially Mafex figures, because they are some of the smallest joints on these figures. Now, let's go ahead and pull them out of the box. We'll talk about the accessory loadout and look at the figure up close in detail. Got the trusty hobby knife. I have long since cut the tape. On the bottom here, I'm just going to slide the blade of my knife under the bottom flap, push toward the back of the box, pop the flap open nice and cleanly, and you can slide everything out. And just a real quick look at the inside of the box. It's just this blue dot matrix comic pattern printed throughout, which does look really nice. One bit of value that always gets overlooked with Mafex figures is they all include this display stand. And taking a look at Wolverine in the tray, not an overwhelming number of accessories, and you might even say not enough accessories. I'm leaning towards that myself. I think that more recent Mafex figures have really left this one in the dust as far as accessory count, especially alternate hands. For me at least, this does come with all the essentials. We have equipped on the figure by default a neutral looking face, fists with no claws, and then alternate heads. We get an angry gritted teeth face, as well as an unmasked Logan head, folded down cowl that he can wear around his neck when he has the unmasked head. And then for hands, there are 2 alternate pairs of hands. In addition to the fists, we have fists with the claws extended. The claws do not swap between hands. They are only on these fists. And then a pair of relaxed, slightly gripping hands. And that is it. I definitely think that this is a little bit light on the accessories. Like, if you subtract the angry head and the alternate pair and one of the alternate pairs of hands, you're looking at the X-Men 97 Wolverine loadout. So, unfortunately, I do think this angry masked head is essential for Wolverine and cannot be omitted. Hasbro, what are you doing? But on top of accessories, I think there are design elements that Mafex brings to their figures that I appreciate enough to justify the price. Let's go ahead and take him out of his tray. And just so you know, import trays usually do not squeeze around the alternate parts. So you don't want to open this vertically or they will all fall out on you. There are a few very common criticisms of this figure. The first is that he maybe could have been a little bit shorter. I personally don't mind like exact height difference as long as the relative height is correct, and Wolverine is shorter than the characters he's supposed to be shorter than. We've got the Mafex Jean Grey and Mafex Cyclops here, and this is kind of what I'm talking about, where they get the relative scale correct. Wolverine is shorter than both of them, and I think most famously, the biggest criticism is these blue stripes on his torso. It doesn't bother me all that much, and I do think it is more intended for like photography to be able to kind of approximate the cel-shaded look of black with blue highlights, which does come across given the right lighting conditions. Would it have been more straightforward if they had just painted them black? I think so. But the fact that they didn't even do that on the reissue of this figure means it's probably on purpose that they've done this, and I think it is something to do with, like I said, using the metallic blue paints to capture a cel-shaded black style. It doesn't bother me at the end of the day. If it bothers you enough to be a deal breaker, I think that's fine. Now, some other very nice design elements of Mafex figures. They have a very, very consistent articulation setup, including kind of best in industry shoulder joints and torso joints. Now, getting into the articulation, we have a very standard setup for Mafex. Almost all of their comic figures have this exact same array of joints, and there is something to be said for not fixing what isn't broken. As I go over the articulation, I like to create these reference lines on the body so you can tell how much things are moving. So what I'll do first, I'll line the arms up kind of horizontally like this, demonstrate forward and backward. Then we'll flip them around, do a T-pose, and we'll talk about range side to side. And then we'll cover any specialty joints like butterfly joints. All right, starting from the top, the head is on Mafex kinky double ball peg here that is slightly bent towards the back. And then the neck is on another single ball joint inside the torso. The reason they like to do that kinked peg is it increases the range looking up, which I think is very, very important for superhero characters. And in this case, gets past 45 degrees, which is fantastic. The reason you want to keep that peg bent towards the back of the figure is going down. Most of the range is provided by this lower neck joint, and it gets the maximum amount with the chin running into the chest, also past 45 degrees. So, brilliant. Next up, we've seen the shoulders swivel around. Biceps also can swivel around, but you do kind of break up the hair at a certain point. But it looks pretty good. It follows the sculpt of the shoulder muscles into the bicep pretty cleanly there. These shoulder pads plug into the back of the shoulder. They're on little ball pegs, so they can kind of pivot up and down a little, or side to side like this. And so you can usually get them out of the way of whatever pose you're trying to hit. His elbow joint is a double hinge. He gets about 130 degree bend, about 90 plus 40 or so. And then his wrists are the Mafex swivel hinge swivel combo joint, which hinge in any orientation that you want. You can put it in a vertical orientation, diagonal to get kind of a compound movement going there. Put it in a horizontal orientation and get a ton of range like that as well. The torso has at least 2, maybe 3 ball pegs between this diaphragm cut and waist joint, which is hidden nicely by the belt. The diaphragm cut is visible, but it does follow the arc of the rib cage really well. I think that's something very important if you're going to put a cut, especially on a character whose anatomy is showing so much. It needs to follow the anatomy, and this is the way to do it for a diaphragm joint. Same as how this is a nice way to do it for a shoulder joint or a bicep joint. And between those two joints, the top one was very tight originally when I got this figure. I heated him, took it apart, applied some shock oil. It now moves with much more fluidity than before, and it works really, really well. That's a really fantastic ab crunch on this figure. So again, past 45 degrees, that's really good. And then leaning backwards, also past 45, very, very good. All together with the neck, he can look straight up very easily. He can look inside his foot line quite easily. Hips are maybe one of the places that I think could be improved on Mafex figures. They are a drop-down ball peg, so there's a hinge going through kind of the middle of the crotch piece with ball pegs coming out on either side that can bend up and down this way to increase the range in the hip joint. So without dropping the hinge, he'll only kick out about that far. But if you bring the hinge down, you can get his kick up to 90 degrees. It does go to the side just a little. Dragon Ball Figure Arts fans might want to look away, but we have a butt sculpt, and Mafex has pretty much always done this, and it's really not a problem. Yeah, the leg does not kick straight back if you try to kick it back well to the side, but again, very much like the Dragon Ball figures, you can make that work as a forward and back split, and I think it looks natural doing that. I think the butt sculpt here is pretty good, and you also get a nice tight wrinkle across the back. Knees are double hinged like the elbows, but they do get a little more range than the elbows. I would say that's past 135, closer to 140, 150. Done some strategic sculpting of the thigh anatomy here to allow for a little bit of extra space for the calf to go through, whereas the bicep, you don't really have as much of that. Ankles are on kind of the same swivel, hinge, swivel combo joint as the wrists, and they work very well. going down 45, up maybe 30 degrees, plus toe hinge for the full 90 degrees. Now starting from the top side to side, the neck can tilt about 45 degrees, and also, of course, swivels around, so you can get this head in any position you want with really great degrees of freedom here. The ability to bring the shoulders in to the body a little bit. He can go way past a T pose, more like a Y pose. His upper torso and lower torso joints combined give him about 45 degrees of tilt. There's really not too much tilting happening at the top joint, so most of the tilt comes from this lower abdomen piece. He can swivel at both the upper and lower joints. Does hit a limit about there. So safely, you can twist the torso about that much. And then like at the head, you can combine all of those points to really twist him around. Okay, at the hips, they kick out to the side. The drop down does help a little bit with that. That's without the drop down, and then with the drop, oops. Well, you can see how these work. Ball peg. Does pop right back on. It's good that if you try to push things too far, they pop apart rather than break. Past 45 on both sides simultaneously. Not quite a complete 180 degree split. And he has really steep ankle pivot thanks to the position of that swivel. And so very easily gets down this low flat on the floor. And then as I was talking about, there really isn't much of a thigh swivel in there. It's kind of an embedded thigh swivel where there's an inner hard plastic piece that plugs onto the ball peg. And there's supposed to be some rotation around that piece, but it doesn't seem to really want to move. And the leg kind of just pops off instead. Happens on both sides, so I don't really know. That's definitely a point that could be improved. But admittedly, it does look very clean without a cut going across the thighs. Similar joint to what Figuarts is using on their 3.0 figures. And it works really well to bring the wrists together in front. They do need to go up a little bit to do that much across the body. A little closer together around the back. And what I really like is above his head. This works really well for like Spider-Man swinging poses and things like that, or two-handed sword gripping poses. All right, and what is Wolverine without his claws? The alternate hands can be a little bit hard to pop onto these pegs, since this particular release didn't come with the sprues, preserve the sockets. So if you do run into that, apply a bit of heat and soften those alternate hands before trying to push them onto the pegs, or you risk breaking those pegs. And that would be sad. I've already done that operation on my figure and he is ready to go. These claws, definitely another point of controversy with this particular release. I don't really know what this design is based on. I definitely have seen Wolverine more often with curved claws. These kind of remind me of the Fox movies with Hugh Jackman, but much longer, and so people don't like that they are both straight and very long, and in particular that they're longer than his forearm, and then that kind of breaks the idea that these retract up into his arm. And I don't really mind these. I think that they are like very dynamic as a result of being a little longer. And so I actually kind of like it. I'm not a curved claws or bust Wolverine fan, so they really don't bother me. I think they look great. Most importantly, they are metallic and sharp looking. I do not love that this is not aligned. This side is much better. I think this maybe just needs a little bit of heat to straighten that middle claw. Much more stable design than Hasbro's claws are usually on their Wolverine figures. Let's get him into like a crouch down Marvel vs. Capcom neutral stance. There's some things working really well for getting this figure into a low crouching pose. First off, the ability for him to look up is just priceless. You can't do a good crouching pose without looking up. His ab crunch is the second point that really sells the pose. The ability to kind of bring the shoulders back a little bit puts more energy into his body. The legs, I will say, are adequate. They're not the best. As we saw, they don't have great thigh articulation, but they do kick forward very well. You get a nice deep bend in the knees, and then the ankles are phenomenal. So the biggest problem is getting into a crouch, and then you kind of can start to use the thigh swivel once the legs are rotated up, but this is where I've gotten into trouble with paint rubbing off of his underwear onto the legs. It does work, and I think Mafex figures are designed to work that way, but I think the paint wasn't factored into that design. Another thing that I really dislike on the Legends figure is the angle that the claws come out of the arm is not straight. It's like slightly this way, and it doesn't work with creating like the lines and arcs that the claws are there to help you create on Wolverine. And then you can very easily put him into motion from there. Get that torso twisting, get those claws back. And then again, the great range of motion in the neck looking up. There we go. But he can get a low crouch very effectively. I'm not sure if Mafex has done a good like swooshing slash effect, but I think some slashing effects would go a long way for this figure as well. Overall, I think this is a fine figure, and I mean that in both senses. It is very, very nice in some ways. The articulation sculpt, I really like the metallic blue paint job, even throughout the stripes. Weird point of praise, but the arm hair, I think, is the best that I've seen done in 1/12 scale. The accessory count is a little low. I think some slashing effects and maybe another pair of hands or two. On a figure that's supposed to be posable and movable, you shouldn't have paint rubbing off just because you're posing and moving it. Tension in the ankles is a little bit light, and that can make balancing a difficult prospect, especially when he is a bit top-heavy, just because he's so barrel-chested. But the overall experience of owning and posing this figure is still, for me, a pleasure. Positives definitely outweigh any neutrals to negatives. The only concern I really have about the Mafex X-Men is, why are they so difficult to find in stock? And when are they going to make Rogue? The most significant ways in which Marvel Legends needs to play catch-up to Mafex and even Jada is the torso setup. Using a swivel with a hinge just doesn't cut it for me anymore. Only being able to move the waist laterally and the torso forward and back just does not give you enough. And just with that little adjustment of the waist, you can see I've angled it down a little bit. It really starts to make these figures come to life. And that is part of what I really enjoy about figure collecting these days. I like to see if I can bring the figure to life, especially through the camera, and to be expressive with subtle body language. It makes a big difference for my enjoyment these days. And so that's where I'm at with wanting to collect Mafex. When people say the Legends X-Men 97 Wolverine is better than this one, I kind of roll my eyes a little bit. Especially when Marvel Legends has another problem I didn't mention, which is the weird way they've decided to texture his arm hair and not paint it. I think Mafex did it right with just the subtle paint application, no weird texture that makes him look like he's been burned really badly or something. And I think Mafex, for me, hits the sweet spot with accessories and subtlety in the articulation. This is one other famous problem with this figure, and a lot of import figures, in fact, is the way that these bicep swivels are connected. Is the elbow joint has just this long, straight peg, and the bicep just goes over that straight peg like a sleeve, and then the peg simply plugs into a hole in the bottom of the shoulder, and there's a little bit of a groove in that peg, but either sometimes that groove isn't deep enough or the peg isn't long enough to create a strong enough connection. And so what you find is sometimes the arms can pop out, but more often than not, I mean, it's easy enough to pop it back on. And that's where it becomes kind of a non-issue for me. If it's like the arm doesn't stay on, that's a problem. But as long as I can put it back on and just know, okay, as long as I move the shoulder and don't pull on the bicep to articulate the arm, it'll be all right. It'll stay on, and if it pops off, it pops right back on. No big deal. That comes down to kind of like a difference in plastics that are used between imports and domestic figures, and I would so much rather have harder plastics than soft, gummy rubber people that you get with Legends sometimes. Makes a big difference for me. But if you don't care about the angle of the waistline on your shelf, then that is totally understandable. Not everybody enjoys figures the same way, and I think that's fine. And that's also why other figure lines exist. Another point of controversy is the quality of the paint. Like, the mixture of the paint looks great, the coverage is not great. And even on my copy here, it's pretty bad on these top stripes. It doesn't fill the space completely, and the space being sculpted kind of just accentuates that. Down through the stripes on his rib cage, same deal. And then the other major area of concern when it comes to paint is actually on these upper thighs, where I've gotten quite a bit of blue rubbing off onto the yellow just from articulating the figure. That's kind of frustrating, and it's one of the reasons why I'm usually in favor of more minimalistic paint jobs on action figures, just because paint and movement do not complement each other. More often, you'll find them on a shelf or in your hands at about arm's length or more, and these problems really don't matter that much to me at that distance. So, and you can say that that is not okay for this price, but that's a value judgment everybody has to make. There's more to that price. I care much more about the posability and the accessories. There is some subtle shading on the yellow, but it's not too prominent. And that's all right. And overall, the sculpt of his muscle anatomy, I think, looks great. I think Marvel Legends goes a little too far into the grotesque, and Wolverine from Mafex here still manages to capture that very stocky, kind of animalistic look, but remains human as well. Also really enjoy how the Mafex setup allows you to capture more subtle character moments, like kind of naturally putting on his cowl. Overall, I really like how Mafex figures can be used to cover such a wide range of action. Violence isn't the only kind of action there is, and so I really like being able to put together little scenes like this, where, I mean, of course we know these characters, we know what's going on here. Of course there's physical action going on here with Scott and Jean walking in the background. There's emotional action in the foreground here with Logan kind of slumped back, the relaxed hands, the unmasked head, the wrist draping over the leg as if like almost lifeless, the leg kind of drooping down to the floor where his foot is curling under like that. Just the sort of sad, sunken feeling, and the subtle scowl on his face is what kind of brought this idea to my mind. You can do something as subtle and nuanced as wiping away a tear. Such a natural, fluid, slumped over crying pose. And that's what I love about Mafex figures. It's fun to think about. It's fun to arrange. I hope you've enjoyed this look at the Mafex number 96 Tiger Stripe Wolverine. I hope it's brought something new to discussions around this figure. And I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.